Profesa, karibu sana.
Professor William Anangisye, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Dar es Salaam, distinguished guests, professors, students, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. Last July, I was appointed as the holder of this prestigious chair at the University of Dar es Salaam. I wish to express my sincere gratitude to the Vice Chancellor of the University of Dar es Salaam and the entire university management for giving me this opportunity to serve. I also wish to express my sincere thanks to all my predecessors in the chair since it was established in 2008. Professor Issa Shivji, Professor Penina Mlama, and Professor Rukaza Mukandala. I'm standing before you today on the occasion of installation of holder of the Mwalimu Julius Nyerere professorial chair in Pan-African Studies. To occupy a chair bearing the name of Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere is not merely an academic appointment. It is a call to responsibility. It is a summons to think deeply, speak honestly, and save Africa with intellectual courage and moral conviction. I'm delivering this inaugural lecture at a moment when Africa is once again being forced to define itself in a rapidly changing world. The theme of the 17th Mwalimu Nyerere Intellectual Festival, that is Geopolitics, Development, and the New Visions for Africa, is not only timely, it is urgent. It requires us to think about Africa not as a passive observer of global events, but as a continent whose future depends on intelligent unity, strategic development, and a bold political imagination. Ladies and gentlemen, within this broad theme, I have chosen to reflect on a sub-theme, African unity and development, a reflection of Nyerere's political thought in contemporary geopolitics. And this is for one good reason. In our contemporary times, the question of African unity is no longer a romantic ideal reserved for speeches and anniversaries. It has become a practical necessity. The pressures of global inequality, climate change, debt dependence, geopolitical rivalry, migration, insecurity, and technological exclusion make unity not only desirable, but urgent. The wisdom of Nyerere remains remarkably relevant because he understood that African unity was never about symbolism alone. It was about power, dignity, self-reliance, and the ability of African peoples to shape their own destiny. Mwalimu once used a simple Zanaki story about a rabbit that declared it was going to kill an elephant. When he asked whether that was possible, the rabbit answered, "I will try and try again." That story captures the spirit of the South and indeed the spirit of Africa which needs today. The lesson is clear. The weak do not overcome the strong by despairing. They overcome by wisdom, persistence, organization, and solidarity. Africa must never give up. Ladies and gentlemen, Nyerere's political thought on unity begins from a basic but a powerful premise: shared destiny. He understood that the peoples of Africa are connected by history, geography, culture, and above all, by a common experience of colonial domination and underdevelopment. Unity, therefore, was not a decorative slogan. It was a strategy for liberation and development. It was also a moral project. For Nyerere, unity was inseparable from equality. He saw socialism and African unity as deeply linked because both aimed at overcoming domination and building a community of mutual responsibility. This is why the union between Tanganyika and Zanzibar in 1964 was not, in his understanding, a mere administrative arrangement. It was an expression of shared heritage and a practical act of national building. Likewise, his commitment to the East African Federation reflected his belief that African states were stronger together than apart. He feared that newly independent countries, if left alone, might fall into competition, suspicion, and the illusion of superiority. Unity for Nyerere was a safeguard against fragmentation and a route towards common progress. At the continental level, the organization of African unity was important, not simply because it represented the African states, but because it served as an instrument of liberation. It helped to sustain solidarity with the peoples of Southern Africa who were still struggling against colonialism and apartheid. In this sense, unity was not inward-looking. It was outward-looking in the best possible way. African unity was tied to the freedom of all Africans. Ladies and gentlemen, the deeper philosophical foundation of Nyerere's unity lay in Ujamaa. Ujamaa was never just a development policy. It was a vision of human society. It rested on the belief that human beings are bound to one another by mutual obligation, and that the purpose of politics is to organize society in a way that reflects that moral truth. Nyerere refused the idea that development could be measured only by accumulation, consumption, or imitation of the rich. He urged that African societies should organize themselves around human needs, social justice, and dignity. That position is strikingly relevant today. In the contemporary world, the language of development is often dominated by numbers: growth rate, flows, debt ratios, export volumes, and the gross domestic product. These indicators matter, but they do not tell us the whole story. A country might grow while its people remain poor, insecure, excluded, and dependent. Nyerere warned against development that merely distributes poverty or imitates the lifestyle of the wealthy. He challenged the poor nations to stop trying to ape the rich. That message remains radical because too much of our development discourse still defines success by how closely we can resemble the industrialized North. Nyerere's thought is also valuable because he understood unity as a means of strengthening bargaining power in an unequal world. He described the third world as resembling a trade union of the poor. The image is powerful. A trade union succeeds not because each worker is strong individually, but because collective organizations gives weak individuals the ability to negotiate with much stronger power holders. In the same way, African countries cannot hope to command a fair place in the world economy by acting as isolated fragments. Alone, many of our states are too small, too dependent, too vulnerable. Together, they can begin to shape markets, institutions, and rules. This brings us to the contemporary geopolitical context. Africa today exists in a world of intensifying competition among major powers, unstable supply chains, contested minerals, climate shocks, and a widening inequality. The world is increasingly multipolar, but multipolarity does not automatically mean justice. New centers of power may emerge, yet smaller and poorer states may remain marginal unless they are organized, strategic, and united. Ladies and gentlemen, this is precisely where Nyerere's warning about undemocratic global power becomes important. He was deeply skeptical of international systems that claimed legitimacy while functioning in the interest of the powerful. He questioned why democracy should be considered indispensable within states but optional in international relations. That question still haunts the global order today. African countries are expected to comply with the rules they did not design, to service debts they did not fully contract on fair terms, to absorb the costs of climate change they did not primarily cause, and to navigate sanctions, aid conditionalities, and trade regimes shaped by others. The problem is not merely political. It is also moral and developmental. International institutions often speak the language of equality while reproducing inequality. They claim to promote development while locking many countries into dependence. They speak of peace while tolerating interventions, proxy conflicts, and a strategic competition that leaves smaller states destabilized. Nyerere's insistence on dignity and fairness remains a powerful reminder that global order must be judged not by the elegance of its rhetoric, but by the justice of its outcomes. One of the most lessons from Nyerere for today's world is that development must be rooted in local realities. He rejected the assumption that there is one universal path that every society must follow. He understood that African countries possess different resources, different histories, different cultural inheritances, and different capacities. Land, water, minerals, skills, institutions, and social traditions all matter. Development, therefore, must not be treated as a one-size-fits-all formula imported from outside. It must be grounded in the capacities and the needs of our own people. This is especially relevant in the age of climate crisis. The environmental question is now inseparable from the development question. Africa is among the regions that contribute least to global emissions, yet it suffers most of the severe consequences of climate change. At the same time, in many parts of the continent, energy poverty forces people to depend on environmentally destructive forms of fuel and production. Nyerere's thought helps us to see that development is not simply about catching up with the industrial north. It is about finding social just and environmentally sustainable pathways suited to African conditions. In practical terms, this means rethinking our development priorities. It means investing in public transport rather than aspiring only on private car ownership. It means strengthening food systems, local manufacturing, value addition, and regional trade. It means building industrial capacity that serves human needs rather than export dependence. It means designing economies that reduce vulnerability to external shocks. Above all, it means rejecting a model of growth that celebrates consumption while ignoring justice. Ladies and gentlemen, Nyerere also understood the strategic importance of South-South cooperation. He knew that African countries and other peoples of the global south must learn from one another, trade with one another, research together, and organize together. The South Commission reflected this conviction. It was not simply an intellectual gathering. It was an attempt to generate practical alternatives to the dominance of the World Bank, the IMF, and the wider structures of global capitalism. It was a recognition that intellectual dependence is also a form of dependence. That insight matters today more than ever. African universities and research institutions must become sites of strategic thought for African development. We cannot continue to outsource our thinking to others and expect to solve our own problems. Brain drain is not only a loss of personnel, it is a transfer of value, a weakening of capacity, and a surrender of agency. If Africa is to advance, it must invest in its scholars, engineers, scientists, policy thinkers, and institutions of learning. We need research networks that generate evidence for African policy, not merely consume theories imported from elsewhere. In the same spirit, regional integration must be given more serious content. The African Union, the East African Community, SADC, ECOWAS, COMESA, and the African Continental Free Trade Area are not ends in themselves. They are instruments. Their purpose should be to deepen practical solidarity, common markets, industrial coordination, infrastructure connectivity, educational exchange, scientific collaboration, and a collective diplomatic power. Integration must move beyond declarations and produce visible benefits in the lives of ordinary people. Ladies and gentlemen, at this juncture, it is important to emphasize that Nyerere's thought was never naive about the difficulties of unity. He understood that unity is not achieved by speeches alone. It requires detailed planning, patient institutional building, and a sacrifice. He also recognized that the global south lacked military and economic power of the north. Yet, he did not interpret that weakness as a reason for passivity. Rather, he argued small states to organize, to resist, to cooperate, and to keep building alternatives. Even where immediate transformation is impossible, solidarity remains possible. To meet, to exchange ideas, to plan together, and to preserve dignity are themselves political acts. This is why Nyerere's legacy is not confined to the history of independence. It speaks directly to our present geopolitical condition. Africa today must learn to navigate a world of rival empires without surrendering its autonomy. It must engage the East, the West, the rising powers with open eyes and firm principles. It must avoid dependence while still pursuing cooperation. It must defend sovereignty while recognizing interdependence. It must be non-aligned in the deepest sense, not passive, but principled, not isolated, but independent, not natural and neutral in the face of injustice, but committed to justice itself. Ladies and gentlemen, the installation of a Nyerere chair at this university is more than an academic milestone. It is an affirmation that African thought matters, that African history matters, and that African unity remains central to the future of the continent. The task before us is not to romanticize Nyerere, but to take his ideas seriously and adapt them to our time. His message to us is simple and demanding. We must unite without erasing our diversity. We must develop without imitating dependence. We must globalize our solidarity without surrendering our sovereignty. We must build economies that serve human beings, not greed. And we must do all this with patience, discipline, and courage. The rabbit may be small, but it does not surrender to the elephant. The African peoples must still face enormous challenges, but you are not condemned to permanent weakness. With vision, organization, and unity, we can build a continent that is not merely surviving in the world, but shaping it. May this chair help us think more deeply, speak more boldly, and serve Africa more faithfully. May it honor the legacy of Mwalimu Nyerere by advancing the cause of African unity, dignity, and development. I thank you for your attention. Asante sana.